Hi everyone! After chapter 12 on all the action potential things, this chapter will definitely be a lot more straightforward. There's still a lot of parts and functions to remember because it's the brain after all, but some of the parts are quite interesting at least. And so for chapter 14, we will discuss all the different parts of the brain. We're not skipping chapter 13 on spinal cord. We will just come back to this later after this chapter because to me it made more sense to talk about the main control center with our brain first before going downwards into our spinal cord and peripheral nervous system. Okay, so let's get started. As we all know, the brain is the main big boss organ for integrating and processing all sensory and motor information we talked about in the last chapter, and it is a seat of higher mental functions such as intelligence, memory, and emotions. And we'll talk a little bit about some of this. And memory we're not going to touch on until the end of chapter 16, but still it is a little, because it's complex, has a lot more to deal with, different, more deeper parts of the nervous system. We won't talk too much about it, but we'll gloss over it, okay? So the brain itself is divided into four main regions. You have the cerebrum, which is this whole area right here that's in nude color that you're seeing. This whole entire area is the cerebrum. The cerebellum, okay, which sits inferiorly to the cerebrum, is right here. This blue region right here down below, that's the cerebellum. This is the cerebrum. And then you have the diencephalon, which is enclosed within the cerebrum here. So this is the diencephalon. Okay, and we'll talk about what makes up these bigger parts of the brain. And then lastly you have the brainstem right here, which is the most inferior portion of the brain before becoming merging along with the spinal cord. Okay, all right, because the further downwards here is then going down towards the spinal cord. Okay, so let's start with, sort of a shallow basic function of these four parts, main regions of the brain. So the cerebrum is, of course, the largest portion of the brain and is divided into your left and right hemispheres. The superficial layer is made up of gray matter called the cerebral cortex, and we already talked about what gray matter is made up of in the last chapter. If there's a lot of gray matter in that area, that means they're mostly made up of cell bodies, whereas white matter, it is mostly made up of myelinated axons. It's either cell bodies or unmyelinated axons for gray matter, okay? And the cerebrum is mainly in charge of all conscious thoughts, sensations, intellect, memory, and all the complex movements, etc. Okay? The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain and is covered with cerebellar cortex. Okay, so cerebral cortex for the cerebrum, cerebellar cortex for the cerebellum. Very straightforward. And many of its function has to do with learning patterns and adjust ongoing movements. What it will do is that it can compare new sensations with previously experienced sensations and adjust accordingly to accomplish a certain skill that you want to learn, for example. And once it becomes a learned skill, the cerebellum is what allows us to do the same movements over and over again, like, for example, riding the bike or, playing the piano or even typing on the keyboard. All those skills that we have to learn, but yet once we learn it, it just becomes a second nature kind of thing. It's all because cerebellum is able to store that pattern information for us so we never forget how to do it again. All right, so the diencephalon includes two main parts. One is called the thalamus right here, this pinkish region here. And we call it, the air traffic controller, kind of like those control tower at the airport that directs airplane traffic, because that's really what it does. It is the part of the brain that receives all the sensory information coming up from the spinal cord, coming up this way, okay? And then it will direct the sensory information to correct locations in the brain. So this way, that way, or that way, wherever it is that it needs to go within the cerebrum, it would direct it to the correct spot in the brain. So that's why it's kind of like that control tower at the airport. The hypothalamus is down in this region, down more so this region right here, okay? Okay, so this is the thalamus. This is the hypothalamus. And that's why it's called hypothalamus, is because it sits underneath. Remember, hypo means under. So hypothalamus means it sits underneath or inferior to the thalamus. And the hypothalamus will talk about all the different functions it has, because it has a whole variety of them. It's kind of like almost it likes to butt into every single thing that's going on in the body. So we'll go over those functions in detail when we get to those detailed parts of the brain. But in general, hypothalamus contains centers that are involved with emotions, autonomic functions, and also hormone production. We'll talk about hypothalamus again in the next semester when we start the endocrine chapter. We start off the second semester with the endocrine chapter because that is a very critical chapter for communication. Everything in the second semester almost has to do with homeostasis of your blood pressure, of your water content, etc. And all of those is monitored by hormones. Okay, so that's why we start the second semester by going over all those glands that are important for releasing hormone that is to regulate homeostasis all over the body. Okay, so the brainstem, which is the last portion of the brain, is divided further into 3 parts, okay? You have the midbrain first. So the midbrain is right here in this green region, and then you have the pons, which is this blue region here, and then the orangey region here, which is the medulla oblongata. If you read the textbook on this chapter, you will find that there are a lot more details, and a lot of the functions just seems to overlap all over the place, and everything sounds like they do the same thing, and it's hard to remember. So I've kind of summarize some of the things in this chapter and try to choose different functions that are more obviously different, okay, so they're easier to remember and they don't sound so overlapping or confusing. All right, so the midbrain functions to process visual and auditory information and control reflexes that are triggered by those stimulus. For example, if you hear something, you see something, and you kind of move in natural reflex. We'll talk about what part of the brainstem is in charge of regulating those processes. And we will talk about, different parts of what is responsible for those information, okay? All right, so the pons is involved with somatic and visceral motor control. What do we mean by that? Well, somatic, we're going to get to that in a little bit in chapter 13. And then in chapter 15 is all about the somatic nervous system. But somatic is usually, it means it has something to do with skeletal muscle movements. And visceral is involved with internal organs. Okay, we actually will bring this term in chapter 13, somatic versus visceral, because there are parts of the spinal cord that is for somatic information, and there's parts of the spinal cord that is for visceral information. So somatic information is dealing with skeletal muscles, start with the same letter, S and S, okay? Somatic for skeletal muscle movements, and visceral is more for, remember we learned about visceral versus parietal, serous membrane. So visceral membrane, we talked about how visceral means organs, dealing with abdominal internal organs. So that's that's what visceral here also means. It's something to do with those digestive organs, abdominal organs, internal organs within the body, okay, whether it is in thoracic or the abdominal cavity. And then the medulla oblongata is the first area of the brain where information coming in from the spinal cord will travel to. So it relays those information to the thalamus or other parts of the brainstem because it is its first location that information is traveling upwards from the spinal cord, and then it can send it to other places or all the way up to the thalamus, and the thalamus will relay those information to the cerebrum. So, in addition of relay of information, it is also in charge of regulating a few autonomic functions, such as your heart rate, blood pressure, and digestion. Okay. We won't talk too much into these parts, okay, but we will have one slide that goes into the specific places in the brain stems as for performing those particular functions when we get to that slide. Okay. So now, in the central part of the brain, there are these hollow chambers called ventricles for circulation of cerebrospinal fluid that we have mentioned in the previous chapter on nervous tissue. We talked about how they're lined with ependymal cells for movement of cerebrospinal fluid. Hence, there are a total of 4 of these ventricles or chambers within the brain for storage and circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. You have 2 lateral ventricles, 2 of these, and these are the largest ventricles of the 4. So this right here and this right here is the lateral ventricle, and each of them sits in the left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum. Now, they don't have a direct tube that connects them to each other until they get to the 3rd ventricle. So they're sitting separately like this. I always thought of it looking like a goat's horn or something, but one sits in the right hemisphere and one sits in the left hemisphere. All right. And then the 3rd ventricle is the area here where it connects and merges the fluid from the 2 lateral ventricles through what's called the intervertebral foramen. Okay, so this right here that's connecting the 2 lateral ventricles together from the 2 hemispheres is called the interventricular foramen. Okay. And then the fluid from the 3rd ventricle will travel to the 4th ventricle, which is this region right here. And I always like to call it the triangle or the little tent-looking thing down by the cerebellum. Okay, so it looks like a tent because I think it, literally it is kind of like that shape, and that shape is in this region right there next to the cerebellum. And the fluid flows from the 3rd ventricle to the 4th ventricle through a tiny little duct called cerebroaqueduct right there. So from this whole region here, okay? So that's the cerebroaqueduct that will allow fluid to move downwards from the 3rd ventricle into the 4th ventricle, and then followed by going more further downwards into the central canal of the spinal cord. Okay, now remember that this is different central canal from osteons. Osteons central canal for bone tissue was for blood vessels. For spinal cord, the central canal is for circulation of cerebrospinal fluid. So make sure you don't mix that up. And we have already talked about the ependymal cells, which are the neuroglia that lines these ventricles and are in charge of producing cerebrospinal fluid that circulates throughout the entire central nervous system, meaning both your brain and the spinal cord. Now, there are 3 cranial meninges that serve to protect our brain, and in a sense, other than protection, they also kind of anchors our brain in place so that if we were to have a big forceful, blunt trauma to the head, our brain won't smush against our skull very much because they're kind of tied down with all these different cranial meninges. Okay, so the outermost layer is called the dura mater, okay, and it actually contains 2 layers. The outer layer here is fused with the periosteum of the cranial bones, which could be parietal, occipital, whichever one it is, but it's our skull, the superior portion, all the portions of our skull that encircles the brain. It is connected, the periosteum of that is connected with the outer layer of the dura mater. And then the inner layer of the dura mater here is what folds into different areas of the brain as anchor and connection. Like that, what I was talking about with, that anchoring of the brain so it doesn't jostle around within the skull too much. So it's kind of, if you imagine you're sitting in the car, these dura folds is kind of acting like seat belts holding the brain down in case that there's a very forceful hit on the skull area. Okay, and these things that folds of the dura mater goes into these areas are called dura folds. Okay. Now, there are two main dura folds, one that goes down the longitudinal fissure of the brain, which is that separation between the left and right cerebral hemisphere, and then the other goes into the transverse cerebral fissure of the brain, which is the separation between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So that's why you see one piece of white material here and another piece of white material here, okay? So the one that goes into the longitudinal fissure that bisects the two hemispheres is called the falx cerebri, okay, cerebri, falx cerebri. Two important sinuses reside within this fold. Other than serving as anchoring, it also provides these, if you want to call it veins. Okay, then the one on top here, right there, that blue area, dark blue area, is called the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, superior sagittal sinus, and we'll talk about the importance of these sinuses in a bit. The one on the bottom here, this blue vein looking thing, is called the inferior sagittal sinus. And if you remember, okay, this cutting the brain in half is called the sagittal section, then okay, so we're looking at this dura folds that goes into that sagittal section. So that's why it's called sagittal sinus. Sinus because it's an empty space for fluid to travel into, and superior means on top, inferior means on the bottom. It's pretty straightforward. All right, and then the other dura fold that goes into the transverse fissure is called the tentorium cerebelli, and it separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So that's why this right here, that white portion, is the tentorium cerebelli. It contains the transverse sinus right there, this blue vein looking thing there, okay, and it will allow blood to drain from back of the head, okay. And after the dura mater, it is supposed to be the next cranial meningeal layer called the arachnoid mater. There shouldn't be any space between these two layers in a normal, healthy person. But if a person had a blunt, really severe, forceful trauma to the head, someone threw a rock at you or something, or in a car accident where the head hits against something very hard, or, disease related to the brain, or somehow there's lack of cerebrospinal fluid within the brain, one can form a gap between these two meningeal layers called the subdural space right there. Okay, so this little gap you're seeing between the dura mater layer right there and then the arachnoid mater there. Okay, so this little tiny space here could be a potential subdural space. Remember that it shouldn't exist in a healthy person, but if, for example, if bleeding happens in that area, it can collect in that particular area and starts to form what's called a subdural hematoma, separating the dura mater from the arachnoid mater. Also, after a person dies, for example, like in a cadaver, this subdural space will also appear. So this is just a potential space within the brain that can develop if there is something abnormal going on. Okay, so the next layer deep to the dura mater is called the arachnoid mater, which form these spider web connections. which forms the spider web connections here within the subarachnoid space. So this whole area is the subarachnoid space, and hence this layer right here, this white layer with these white lines, that's the arachnoid motor, the second layer in to the cranial meninges. And then it continues around the entire brain, this way and that way, all the way down, follow into the spinal cord. Okay, so this subarachnoid space is formed by this arachnoid motor here, and this is where cerebrospinal fluid will flow for both the brain and the spinal cord as well. And then you have, lastly, the innermost meningeal layer called the pia mater, which actually sticks very closely to the surface of the brain and is anchored by processes of astrocytes. If you remember, we talked about the 6 different types of neuroglia, 4 of which resides in the central nervous system, and this was the astrocytes that sits within the central nervous system, acting as those cells that are forming that 3-dimensional framework within the central nervous system in the brain. And so they are kind of in charge of or involved with forming those pia mater layer of the brain as well. Okay, and within the pia mater, there's also blood vessels, cerebral blood vessels specifically, that penetrate into the brain to deliver oxygen, nutrients, etc. Okay, so as we have mentioned, a fluid called cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the entire brain and the spinal cord. It kind of serves to support the brain so that the brain is literally suspending or floating within the skull. Not only is it a good, sense of cushion, like an airbag around the brain, but it also serves as sort of making your brain weigh a lot less as well, because now it's suspending within some fluid instead of sitting right next to the skull. It also cushions delicate neural structures because we are, as you can imagine, the nervous system is one of the most important organ systems we have, and yet those neurons don't divide once they are damaged. Okay, we can, rely on some repair for peripheral nervous system, but central nervous system, we almost can't afford for it to be damaged in any way, and that's why there's all these different layers, cerebrospinal fluid, all these other structures for cushioning and anchoring down the brain to our skull. The other last thing, wherever there's fluid, kind of like with serous fluid or with synovial fluid, where there's fluid, it also functions as a form of diffusion. So cerebrospinal fluid also function to transport nutrients, chemical messengers, waste, kind of like allowing those things to diffuse between the fluid and the cells that is exposed to. Other than where cerebrospinal fluid is produced, the ependymal cell lining is technically freely permeable between the cerebrospinal fluid and the cells that it surrounds, or the tissues that it surrounds. So durafolds acts like seatbelts in a car, and cerebrospinal fluid is acting like airbags that cushions and protects our brain from any cranial trauma of any sort. There's a specific area within each ventricle called the choroid plexus. So this is important. You have choroid plexus there, here, and here within each of those ventricles we were talking about. And the choroid plexus, with plexus, you remember that means a network of stuff, in this case network of blood vessels, that is in charge of producing cerebrospinal fluid, where ependymal cells with cilia, you see this is part of that choroid plexus right here, the capillaries that form those choroid plexus area, and here are those ependymal cells that lines that area, and around the places where cerebrospinal fluid is supposed to be secreting out of, you see these little lines coming out of those ependymal cells, which are the cilia, and they will secrete the fluid and move fluid along in circulation. Now, the route that cerebrospinal fluid circulation goes is it will travel from the choroid plexus of each of the ventricles, whether lateral ventricle, third ventricle, fourth ventricle. It will travel into other ventricles, of course, because fluid will be generated here in the lateral and then start going into the third ventricle and then going into the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. And then from there on, it will travel either to the central canal of the spinal cord or upwards around the brain. Okay, whichever the case, it is that subarachnoid space where we're talking about that are formed by the arachnoid motor. That's why it's called subarachnoid space, because it's underneath the arachnoid motor. Sub meaning underneath. Okay, so subarachnoid space that allows the cerebrospinal fluid to go around the brain, spinal cord, along with the called an equina. We'll talk about what this is in chapter 13, which is basically the last terminal portion of the spinal cord that ends in a horsetail-like manner. So that's called the equina. And then it goes back up. Once it goes down, then it goes back upwards, okay? Here or here, it go around the entire brain, and then it will eventually drain to somewhere, and this is why we need to talk about this. So, as the cerebrospinal fluid circulates around the entire area, it allows materials to diffuse and from the interstitial fluid of the nervous tissue to either remove waste material or to the circulatory system via capillaries or transportation of important nutrients for neural cells. So cerebrospinal fluid is doing a multiple of critical things for our nervous system. Now, just like how a fountain has a place for recirculation or drainage of the fluid, so does the brain. Once the cerebrospinal fluid has traveled through the entire central nervous system, it can be reabsorbed via these structures here called the arachnoid villi or arachnoid granulation. They mean the same thing, okay? But they are these structures that penetrate into the dura mater and allow fluid to move into the superior sagittal sinus. So remember, this is the dura mater right here, the meningeal layer anyway, and this is the outer dura mater layer right here, and then this is the inner dura mater layer right there, and this is the arachnoid mater with its spider web connections, okay? And then you have this subarachnoid space that is indicated by that, and cerebrospinal fluid is just moving in and then into these arachnoid granulation, arachnoid villi, and then goes into the superior sagittal sinus. So that's why the superior sagittal sinus is so critical, because it is for that important reabsorption of cerebrospinal fluid. Because it's got to be in a circuit, like I said, kind of like a fountain. It has to drain somewhere. It has to be reabsorbed somewhere else, okay? And that these little guys here, the arachnoid villi or granulation, will be doing that for us. Okay, so this is what allows those waste material picked up from the central nervous system to travel back into venous circulation of the blood. That's where the superior sagittal sinus and inferior sagittal sinus, or the transverse sinus, those are all what's going to lead and drain back into the venous circulation of the blood. Venous circulation means veins going back towards the heart in the circulatory system. Okay, and then those waste material can then be getting rid of through the urinary filtering system that we'll talk about in the next semester. Okay, but sometimes now these arachnoid villi can have problems with them, where maybe it was malformed, or if bleeding occurred that result in formation of a clot that blocks these arachnoid villi, then cerebrospinal fluid cannot be reabsorbed into that superior sagittal sinus we're talking about here. In this whole area, if this drain was blocked, for example, kind of like how your sink has, gunk in it and it no longer drains stuff, all that fluid is going to back up and start to accumulate within the brain itself. Now, this can lead to a condition we call hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus means that, there's water collecting and accumulating within the brain, and literally water, because we're talking about cerebrospinal fluid, and this can actually lead to enormously expanded skulls in babies due to the fact that their cranial bones aren't fused together yet and are connected via those fontanelles that we have talked about and identified in lab. So in adults, so in infants or babies, that's what's going to happen is they will have big heads like these, okay, expanded skulls because of all that water that's accumulating in the brain. And in adults, our skull can expand, so it's a more detrimental effect in a sense, because now what that pressure, that that water pressure that's building up within the brain will now can't be getting rid of through expansion of the skull, because our skull is all connected together permanently through the sutures we talked about. And hence that pressure is going to start pushing on our brain, which then that can end up, literally smushing our brain and cause damages to the brain if it was prolonged enough and not immediately seek attention at the hospital to get rid of that extra cerebrospinal fluid somehow. And hence, this is the treatment that is usually involved with hydrocephalus. They would insert a tube called a shunt, okay, and it is usually surgically inserted into a ventricle. And let's say it was the lateral ventricle here that is really expanded. They're going to insert that little shunt or tube into the lateral ventricle. And then they will allow that, it will be able to allow that excess fluid to drain into the chest or the abdomen area, usually in the abdomen area, for reabsorption, in those areas instead. So that way, there's some way of getting rid of those fluid and redirecting that fluid from your brain towards other areas of the body where you can reabsorb those same fluid into the venous circulation just as you can anywhere else. So currently, there is no prevention or cure for hydrocephalus according to this Hydrocephalus Association, and this is pretty much all we can do in terms of treatment, how to alleviate that water pressure within the brain. Okay. All right, and the easy way to remember hydrocephalus is hydro means water. Okay, so it must be something to do with water accumulating in the brain itself. Okay. Now, unlike muscle cells, neurons don't have any energy reserves like glycogen or creatine phosphate. Neither do they have myoglobin as backup of supply of oxygen, and hence the brain is heavily dependent on the circulatory system via blood vessels and all the vasculatures they provide to give energy and oxygen demand for the brain, which is in high demand. We talked about last chapter how ATP is very critical for all the conduction of action potentials and resetting the ions back into their original positions using the supplying the sodium potassium pump. Okay, so that's why we need that constant good blood supply. And hence, at the blood that picks up arterial end, we call it, arterial meaning this is blood that has picked up oxygen from the lungs that travel through the heart into the aorta and is distributed into the brain via what's called the internal carotid arteries and vertebral arteries. We will actually have to identify these arteries in the next semester and where they're located. And once blood has dropped off its oxygen to the brain, it will pick up waste products like carbon dioxide, for example, and leave the brain via the internal jugular vein, which is in that same area. So that's why on the bottom of the skull, when you were studying for your lab practical 2 in terms of bone marking on the bottom of the skull, you saw that the carotid canal or foramen is very close to the jugular foramen, okay, because those two are carotid canal is what allows this internal carotid arteries to go through, and then the jugular foramen is where the internal jugular veins go through, and these are around that same area for either delivery of blood to the brain or collection of blood back to the heart from the brain. So that's why they're more located close together within the skull. Okay. And then what happens is that, once blood goes back into the jugular vein, it will drain from the durovenous sinuses as well. We were talking about earlier, those sagittal superior sinus, inferior sagittal sinus. They will drain those sinuses as well and bring it back to the heart via the venous circulation. So we'll talk about more about arteries and veins of the circulatory system next semester in the cardiovascular system chapter. That's another difficult chapter in the next semester. Is actually divided into 3 different chapters, just talking about blood, heart, and blood vessels. All right, and hence the cerebral vascular diseases are when you have a clot that happens within these blood vessels that particularly serve to deliver blood toward our central nervous system, particularly the brain. So, cardiovascular disorders can interfere with normal supply to the brain. Cardiovascular disorders like arteriosclerosis that we'll talk about in the next semester, where there are plaque formation within the cardiovascular system in the blood vessels, and this can affect the internal carotid artery. So if there's a blockage in the internal carotid arteries, blood can't flow to the brain as efficiently, and that can lead to a cerebral vascular accident, CVA, or more commonly known as a stroke. Or sometimes there's what we call transient ischemic attack, TIA, which is what people call as a mini stroke, meaning that this is a stroke that lasts for just minutes or hours and it resolved on its own. So just because it resolved on its own doesn't mean that TIA isn't a health alert for the individual. A lot of times the TIA or mini stroke is just warning signs that an actual stroke may be coming. Okay, so because the fact that there was a clot lodged somewhere and then dislodged somewhere else, that means maybe very likely that there are other locations of blood clots in other areas that's going to come back and give the person a stroke. So those are not taken lightly. So those that blocks the brain blood vessels are called CVA, stroke, and those that block the cardiovascular system is cardiovascular disorder and heart attack that we'll talk about, cardiac arrest and all that stuff. Okay. Now, we mentioned about the blood-brain barrier in the previous chapter and that it forms a filter or barrier that separates the blood from the cardiovascular system and those in the nervous tissues. So the capillary has an extra layer of cells where astrocytes here, like these, are wrapping their processes or appendages around the blood vessel. You see how it kind of extends its cytoplasmic space and then has this flat area that covers it up, extends, and then this flat area that covers it up. Okay, so these are what's called the foot processes of the astrocyte that can cover up the capillary that serves the brain. And what these will do is that they will prevent leakage of materials or even organisms like bacteria that may be harmful from coming in through from the circulatory system into the nervous system. So there are a few blood barriers around the body other than the brain, but their main purpose is all the same. It's just to avoid potential harm to get to these critical locations of the body like the brain. So wherever there's areas of the body where it is very critical for formation of something. For example, there's also blood thymus barrier, and the thymus is very critical as a child for formation of T cells, which is functioning as your immune system. So wherever there's spots where you have these very critical foundation of your organ system, you have these blood barriers to make sure that anything that's traveling around the body doesn't get to those important areas, which can impede the formation of that particular organ system or complete shutdown of that particular organ system, which can have detrimental effects where the person can die. Okay, so the blood barrier that surrounds the brain, that surrounds capillaries that go to the brain, is called the blood-brain barrier. And what the blood-brain barrier allows through are usually something small, lipid-soluble compounds like oxygen, carbon dioxide, and glucose. And then everything else they won't allow through, okay, to make sure that we're not delivering anything harmful into the nervous system. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the functions with other detailed parts of the brain, finally down to the individual functions of the brain. We'll start with the midbrain here, and then we'll go up into the diencephalon, and then finally the cerebrum, okay? All right, so the midbrain here can be separated into 3 parts. So this is that midbrain portion we're talking about, the green color region, and there can be 3 different areas that is divided into. The tectum is known as the roof of the midbrain. The tegmentum, which forms the walls and floor of the midbrain. Both tectum and tegmentum contain gray matter, which means it's mostly made up of cell bodies. And then you have the white matter of the midbrain, which is called the cerebral peduncles. Okay, so these are those cerebral peduncles. I'll point at these in a bit when I talk about it. But remember, white matter is made up of myelinated neurons. So we will have a good idea. We already have a good idea, some sort of, preliminary idea about what cerebral peduncles do. Okay, so let's start with the tectum. The tectum of the midbrain contains 2 pairs of sensory nuclei. Now, before I talk about these nuclei, make sure you understand that the nuclei in the brain is not the same as nucleus in a cell. They're both spelled the same way, okay, nuclei in cells versus nuclei in the brain, but they don't refer to the same stuff. It's not the nucleus of the cell. A nuclei in the brain refers to a cluster of neurons in the brain that tends to have similar connections and functions. And because within each part of the brain, there can be different sections for performing different tasks. So that's why they end up calling these nuclei or areas or regions where if it involves multiple parts working together for that similar task, okay? So sometimes it's even called a center if there's multiple things coming together to accomplish a certain complex movement, for example. And we'll talk about some of those centers later on in the chapter. Okay, so nuclei just mean regions where these neurons are clustering together and they perform that one function, okay? It's just kind of like having different regions of the heart, for example, or the lungs, but now you're talking about the brain, okay? All right, so the 2 nuclei in the tectum is located in this here and this here. This one right here on the top is called the superior colliculi, and superior colliculi functions to receive visual inputs from the thalamus. Remember that you have the thalamus right here, okay, and they can receive sensory information from the spinal cord. And if we're talking about visual and auditory, it actually doesn't have to travel from the spinal cord. It's traveling right from your eyes and your ear, because your cerebrum is all around here, and there's an optic nerve that goes from your eyes towards the occipital lobe, and hence it has that optic nerve actually has to crisscross over within the thalamus called the optic chiasm, a place you have, a part of the brain that you actually have to identify in lab. And that's where that visual input from the thalamus will then get to your superior colliculi of the midbrain. Okay, and it is once it receives that visual input information, the superior colliculi can then regulate and sort of give control over that reflex movement of the eyes, head, and neck in response to that visual stimuli. So for example, let's say in a dark theater, it's all dark, okay, you're paying attention to the front screen, but all of a sudden someone's phone starts lighting up next to you, then almost everybody has that natural reflex of, oh, let's look to the left, and where's that light coming from? Ooh, where's that light coming from on the right side, So those are those reflexes that's made possible by your midbrain, because your visual inputs is coming as a stimulus and you want to act as a response, okay? And then the inferior colliculi right here is what receives the auditory information from the medulla oblongata. So you have a pair of it actually. So both of these are the superior colliculi, and both of these are the inferior colliculi. Inferior is doing the same thing, kind of like the superior colliculi, but it is receiving auditory information from the medulla oblongata and the pons, and control that reflex movement of the head and neck and trunk in response. So kind of like you're paying attention to the lecture video right now with the computer or tablet in front of you. All of a sudden someone opens the door and then slams the door. Then you look backwards. Where's that noise coming from? Who's coming in? So that is a reflex that's formed by auditory information. You hear the door slamming, and hence you act in response to see who opened or slammed the door. Okay. So what I tell my students, easy way to remember this is superior colliculi is for visual information, which means your eyes. Okay, your eyes is kind of laying superiorly over your ears. Yes, your ears is kind of lateral to your eyes, but it's also kind of laying lower in a position than your eyes. So superior has to do with eyes, and then inferior has to do with ears, which is lower than your eyes. Okay. All right. And then on to the tegmentum, which contains two main areas. And with each of these, your book goes into so much detail with a lot of parts. So that I'm already narrowing down all these little parts from this chapter 14 in your book. So tegmentum, we'll talk about two areas. One is called the red nucleus, which contain neurons that release not neurons that release. They contain, they're mainly there for giving subconscious motor commands that affect your upper limb position and background muscle tone. So people that have problem with the red nucleus of the tegmentum may not be able to know where their upper limb is, or they can do weird movements that is not voluntarily controlled based on what the red nucleus, the health status of the red nucleus of the tegmentum within the midbrain. Okay, and then you have this other area here, this green area. It's called the substantia nigra. Substantia nigra is the neuron that is for releasing dopamine. And remember in the last chapter, when we talked about the types of neurotransmitter one can have, dopamine has this inhibitory effect that is responsible for allowing us to produce smooth movements. In patients with Parkinson's disease, they are characterized by that rigidity and stiffness in movement, or not even able to initiate some movement at all, is because they don't have enough dopamine, and hence people with Parkinson's disease usually have loss of neural activity around the substantia nigra. Okay, and then lastly, you have your cerebral peduncles, and we were saying that this is the area of the midbrain that contains white matter. And you see how it's kind of has that longitudinal lines. So it kind of makes sense because these are myelinated axons, probably all bundled up together. And remember that myelinated axons are for allowing those electrical signals to go through in forms of action potential. So these cerebral peduncles are serving as descending neuron fibers that goes into the cerebellum and carry voluntary motor commands issued by your cerebral hemisphere into the cerebellum. And it goes downwards. So that's why it has those lines in there, and that's why they're mainly made up of white matter, because they're for that transmission of electrical signals. Okay, so the cerebellum, as we have mentioned, are in charge of processing and coordinating muscular activities and then turn them into a learn pattern automatically. So we can do the same skill over and over and over again without really forgetting everything about it. So for example, when we are still babies learning how to stand up straight and walk, our cerebellum is learning what it takes for our muscles to maintain that upright stance posture. And the fact that we can stand up from our chair now without losing our balance is because our cerebellum has stored and learned that information on how to do those automatic adjustments in our muscles to maintain that balance and equilibrium. So cerebellum, one of the function it has is it allows our muscles to know what to do in order for that right posture. The cerebellum is also in charge of programming conscious and subconscious movement, both of them together, because sometimes you need both in order to accomplish a skill. So for example, when we're learning how to ride a bike or play the piano, the first time we try doing it is usually very choppy. For riding a bike, we may even fall the moment we try to put both feet on bike pedals when you were a child, or if you learned it when you were an adult. Or the first time you're on the piano, you have to press the key, one by one at a time, getting your fingers accustomed to the positions of the keys. But eventually, with practice, our cerebellum can compare what we want to do with our muscles with other proprioceptive or positioning information. For example, I know if I put my feet on the pedals in a certain way, in a certain position, and get moving by pushing the pedal forward, I can quickly pick up my other feet to put on the other pedal and continue riding, achieving balance. Or if we go back to the playing piano example, you will soon learn the position of the keys, and eventually you don't even have to look at your fingers anymore to play a song fluently. And that's because your cerebellum is integrating those information coming in, both consciously, where you're thinking you want to put your fingers or your foot, okay? And then subconscious movement. Eventually, that's what we call, that's what we mean by eventually it'll become a second nature to you. Well, it becomes a second nature that you don't have to think of it anymore, is because your cerebellum will then set that information as a pattern for you that you don't have to think to really put those limbs into action. And the amazing thing about our cerebellum is that once we learn how to do a skill, it's almost hard to forget it. Once you learn how to ride a bike, for example, even after not touching the bike for many years, you may be a bit shaky at first, but the moment you get practicing again, the pattern memory is still there, and you will soon fly up and down the hills again, and you don't end up needing to relearn the skill like you first did when you didn't know how to ride a bike. And same thing with piano. Once you learn how to play the piano, you might be a little, rusty at first after years of not playing, but once you pick it back up, once you start playing and practicing again, it's like and you never stop. Okay? All right. And maybe because of all that coordination and programming that's involved with the cerebellum, this particular part of the brain contains a special type of neuron called the Purkinje cells. And what's special about these Purkinje cells is that they are neurons with cell bodies that have an extensive amount of dendrites. You see, this is a cell body, and all of this is dendrites of that Purkinje cell. And because of how much dendrites it has, one Purkinje cell or neuron can actually receive inputs up to 200,000 synapses. This is more synapses possible than any other neuron in the brain. Okay, so remember all those little presynaptic neuron and postsynaptic neuron we talked about in the last chapter. Now, all those synaptic clefts, we can actually form 200,000 of those synaptic clefts on one Purkinje neuron. Okay, so that's pretty amazing. And they're known to be a type of inhibitory neuron that releases the neurotransmitter GABA. And remember from last chapter, we talked about GABA has a type of inhibitory means, okay, called IPSP, if you remember from last chapter. And GABA controls the rate at which signals will fire in the cerebellum to produce that precise output from neurons that results in that accurate and smooth motor coordination, such as hand movement when you're dancing, when you're playing the piano, or when you're typing on your keyboard. All those things is possible because these Purkinje fibers is able to do some inhibition signal that allows you to do those smooth movements, kind of like dopamine. So a lot of times, with these nervous system that we talk about, not only do we need excitatory synapses, but we also need inhibitory synapses, where we need to do a little of both in order to produce that movement. And one thing we didn't talk about in terms of muscles, and thankfully I cut that out because the muscles is already a lot to begin with origin, insertion, and action. But there's also antagonistic muscles. Okay, so antagonistic muscles actually have to be inhibited, and then your protagonist muscle, the one doing the main movement, have to be excited in order for you to do one swift movement. Okay. So that's why you need some of those inhibitory signals coming through as well for those antagonistic muscles. Okay. All right. And kind of like going back to the Parkinson's disease, why people without not enough dopamine ends up having those stiff and rigid movement is because they lack that inhibition as well. Okay. All right, moving on to the diencephalon. And then the diencephalon, of course, is sort of above, sitting superior to our midbrain, and then at the most superior portion of the diencephalon, it contains what's called the epithalamus, or the roof of the diencephalon, and it includes a structure called the pineal gland. So we follow this whole thing right here. This whole thing right here is the diencephalon, and we're looking at this region right here, and we're looking at this part, and then it ends in this little gland right there. That little gland is the pineal gland, and which you will have to identify in lab for the brain. And what the pineal gland does is actually an endocrine structure that secrete the hormone melatonin. Now, remember I said to not mistake melanin with melatonin. Melanin was something that was released by the integumentary system from our melanocytes to give you brown pigment. But melatonin, which is off just by a few letters, is a hormone that's important for regulating your day-night cycle, which is your circadian rhythm, and also reproductive functions as well. So that's why the pineal gland is critical for that circadian rhythm of your body. And then you have the thalamus, and as we have already talked about, the thalamus is the main air traffic controller that relays sensory information ascending from the spinal cord into the cerebral cortex. So the sensory information like emotional states, touch pressure, pain, temperature, proprioception. Remember, proprioception is your sense of position. And then visual and auditory information, all that good stuff, has to pass through the thalamus, and the thalamus is going to relay it to the correct place. Visual information, for example, goes all the way back to the occipital lobe of your cerebrum. Okay? All right. And now, the hypothalamus has a whole variety of functions, like I was mentioned earlier. Even though it's a very small area here in the diencephalon, it is just, so this whole thing here is the thalamus. This region here that looks like, I like to call it like the double hill, because it really, if you look at it upright, it kind of looks like that, okay? But if you turn it upside down and put it there, that's how it shapes like, okay? So that's the hypothalamus of the diencephalon, and the hypothalamus has all these different variety of functions, and we'll discuss this, okay? But it contains centers that are involved with many emotions and visceral processes, and link nervous and endocrine systems. See what I mean by it? Kind of, like to step a foot into everything. Your emotions, your digestive system, and even your nervous and endocrine system, it has to step a foot into. So we'll discuss its 7 different main functions here for the hypothalamus. First, as part of the endocrine system, the hypothalamus produces two important hormones. Okay, with the endocrine system, like I was saying, is the first thing we'll talk about next semester, because that's for what maintains homeostasis by communication with hormones. So the two hormones that hypothalamus itself produce is called the ADH or oxytocin. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone, which is mainly to restrict water loss by your kidneys, and we'll talk about that in the next semester, where if your body is in dehydration mode, not enough water, then your hypothalamus will release ADH, which then punch little holes within your nephrons within the kidneys to allow more water reabsorption back into the body. Okay, again, this is something we'll touch on in detail when we get to the urinary system in the next semester. Oxytocin is the hormone that stimulates smooth muscle contraction in the uterus during labor and delivery. And it also is in charge of activating mammary glands of females and prostate glands of males. So when a woman is nursing, for example, and from her breast, the fact that she can eject milk from her baby is because of this particular hormone, oxytocin, kind of adding to what we're talking about in terms of positive feedback of homeostasis. Positive feedback mechanism of the baby sucking on the woman's breast. Okay, it signal your hypothalamus to release that oxytocin for ejection of milk. Okay. Now, remember from chapter 1 when we talked about homeostasis of body temperature, and then we talked about the receptor, control center, and effector. And we remember that that particular diagram shows a control center we mentioned was the hypothalamus. So that's its second main function, is to regulate body temperature. And when body temperature falls, it will communicate with the medulla oblongata to control blood flow by regulating the diameter of blood vessels. And if it gets colder, it will undergo vasoconstriction. If it gets hotter, it will undergo vasodilation. Okay? Something we'll come back to talk about in the next semester. And thirdly, it also plays a role in autonomic function, where it just coordinates activity that regulate heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and even digestive functions. Okay, that's why it's, really putting a foot into everything within the body. And the hypothalamus also serves as a main middle guy that coordinate between the two organ system of communication, which is your nervous and endocrine system. And they do this by producing what's called regulatory hormones that inhibit or stimulate endocrine cells in the pituitary gland, or then that pituitary gland will produce other hormones that will control other endocrine organs within the body that's further downstream, like the pancreas, adrenal gland, etc. Okay. And so what we will learn in the next semester is that a lot of the downstream hormones that are released by our endocrine glands have to be stimulated by a group of what's called releasing hormones in the hypothalamus. So, for example, in the reproductive system's application's sake, the function of our gonads or our sex organ is coordinated via hormones called LH and FSH. And you may have heard of that, and luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which both are regulated by hormone release from the hypothalamus called GnRH, or gonadotropin releasing hormone. So that's why, other than all those other stuff that the hypothalamus do, it also does that very important job as sort of overseeing both nervous and endocrine system, and they're able to control our endocrine system by releasing these releasing hormones. Okay. And the fifth function, the hypothalamus, also has something to do with our circadian rhythms by being the guy that receives input information from retina of our eyes, and then which adjusts activities of other regions of the hypothalamus, pineal gland, or other reticular formation around the brain. Our eyes, that's why they say how our circadian rhythm is controlled is by how much daylight we're seeing in our eyes, okay, is because that information of sunlight reaching our eyes is actually sending information to our hypothalamus that tell us, hey, it's daytime. Or if it's complete darkness, that's why they say when you sleep, you should turn off all your lights, is because that's a signal via your eyes that's telling your brain you're not receiving a lot of light information, which means maybe it's dark outside and it's nighttime and you need to go to sleep. Okay. So that's how this circadian rhythm can be set, and why when we travel to another country with completely different time zone, we have to reset those circadian rhythm by going out in the daytime and shutting off our lights in nighttime to make sure we can reset that circadian rhythm back into that country's time zone. Okay? All right, so there's also subconscious control of the skeletal muscle contractions for the hypothalamus that directs somatic motor patterns that's associated with rage, pleasure, pain, or sexual arousal. For example, our facial expressions. Okay, when we're happy, we're smiling. When we're really happy and want to laugh, okay, our muscles then laugh. Okay, our diaphragm is contracting to allow us to laugh. And when we're angry, we make that angry face by, crunching moving our eyebrows closer together, all that stuff that we're doing that has to do with our emotions has, the hypothalamus has a role in that as well. Okay. And lastly, which is kind of related to the sixth function, the hypothalamus also produces emotions and behavioral drives, where specific centers produce sensations that lead to a change in behavior. For example, when we're feeling hungry, okay, some people, when they're hungry, they get angry. Remember the hangry feeling. So hungry is a sensation you're receiving as a sensory input from your digestive system that you need to eat. Okay, well, hypothalamus then related to a behavioral outcome that says, I'm upset, I'm hungry, I need to go eat now. Okay, so but some people are okay with hungry. Some other people are, okay, I'm hungry, I gotta go eat. Or some people even skips meals. Okay. So this change in that behavior, of course, is different between individual, and what sort of drives that is your hypothalamus. Okay, when we're some people, in the sense, when they're angry, they cannot eat. Okay, so that's another thing that sets your how likely you are to do something. Okay, if you're angry, you lose your appetite. If you're sad, you lose your appetite. Or when you're happy, you gain appetite. Okay, those things are then all controlled by this particular part in the hypothalamus, and that's why you see here within the hypothalamus, this small little double hill triangular area has a lot of little parts to it. Okay, there are a whole variety of regions and nuclei in charge of all those different things in the body that we talked about. Okay, so let's stop here as part 1, and we will come back here for part 2 of chapter 14 because it has been in an hour.